And good evening, y'all, and welcome back to Settle the Scores. Back tonight after having last week not having a show due to the 248th observance of Independence Day. Hope everybody had a wonderful celebration and had a nice time wherever you were and whatever you ended up doing on the 4th. And just if we can get a verification, just want to make sure that audio is working all right. There was a little bit of something going on with the intro, so just want to make sure y'all can hear me. If you can, please just leave me a comment. Just let me know that everything's going well. But appreciate everybody tuning in tonight as we are back at it with another episode of Settle the Scores. Another week of Rocky baseball is in the books, and we're coming up on the midway point, about to head into the All-Star break, and also one of my favorite events, the MLB first-year player draft comes up, starts on Sunday night. So looking forward to that as well. We're going to talk a good amount about that, about some guys that I'm interested in, about some guys that our Colorado Rockies may be interested in with that early pick that they have. And Mr. Wiltsey says, seems fine. Thank you so much, Mr. Wiltsey. Hope you had a wonderful Independence Day celebration, and glad to have you on tonight, sir. And Keith secondarily also confirming that things sound good. All right, perfect. Appreciate that from both of y'all. And with that said, let's get into it. So I'm going to talk about, as usual, going to talk a little bit about what happened this past week with regard to the games first, and then we're going to jump into what's going on with the lead up to the draft on Sunday. Keith says, "Star All-Star, Mr. Ryan Scoop." Keith, thank you so much. Really appreciate y'all helping me out, and appreciate, again, you guys confirming that with me just there. And looking forward to seeing what everybody's got for me tonight and what everyone wants to talk about tonight as we tear through some of these recent games, unpack some of the recent trends on the field, and then talk a little bit about the future potential of the Colorado Rockies, especially with that first-round pick that they have on Sunday. Aloha to you. The 4th was great out here in Honolulu. You know what, Mr. Wiltsey, I can't imagine there's too many bad days out there in Honolulu. So, but no, that's wonderful. I'm glad you had a wonderful celebration, and I can only imagine some of the scenes you get to observe out there in a place like Honolulu on the 4th. So, really glad you got to enjoy that and had a wonderful time. That being said, going into this, again, I'm going to go into focus on the last week. We've got a realm of about 7 games we're going to be looking at from just going back to the 4th last week. Not actually a bad stretch of Rockies baseball, actually. We're coming in, not including today's game, we're coming in on a 4-3 stretch in the last 7 games. Excuse me. Those 3 losses were some pretty significant margins against 2 against the Cincinnati Reds in Cincinnati, and taking 1 at home against the Royals. But those other 2 games against the Royals, that game that started all off against Mr. Heron's Milwaukee Brewers. I'm sure he'll be tuning in soon. He always does. That first game against, or the last game of the series, but the first game of this stretch against his Brewers, and then coming up to that 1-run W yesterday against the Cincinnati Reds. So not a bad stretch at all recently for the Rockies. One of the better stretches they've seen this season. Y'all know I'm not a huge fan of pitchers of record. I don't think that means a ton in this day and age, but we are seeing them kind of spread around a little bit. We got a W on Molina, we got 1 on Vodnik, 1 on Gomber, and 1 on Freeland. So nice to see some different faces kind of switching it up and taking sharing the success a little bit. And also not the most on field and the most relevant in terms of winning or losing, but it does fascinate me. It was almost 49,000 fans at each the last game against the Milwaukee series and the first game against the Royals series. Not the two series I would have thought had a ton of draw, but we got almost 50,000 fans at each of those games, which is rather fascinating, both home games. So I don't know. I just found that relatively kind of something that caught my attention. And actually, I'll parlay that because this kind of ties in both of those topics together. But what has we've talked a little bit recently, quite a bit, about the bullpen for the Colorado Rockies and how that has been more often than not has been kind of a leaky gutter for this team, not just this year, but in years past. But in 3 of their 4 wins in this stretch, they've been saved by none other than Mr. Beeks himself. I've spoken a little bit recently about how I thought that Beeks could be potentially somebody who's in the running for maybe a little bit of a bump in his production, a little bit of an improvement. Now, of course, he blanked the bet against the Reds yesterday, but prior to that, he was doing pretty well. He's got 3 saves on his name recently, so he's been pitching some pretty big innings and getting some pretty big outs for this team, and doing a very impressive job of doing so. Beeks is somebody that I think has been underrated for quite some time now. I know that in the very beginning of his career, he spent a little bit of time with the Boston Red Sox some years ago, and had been in with the Rays for a while ever since. But his ERA is not the greatest this year, but again, not something I particularly look at as much with relief pitchers. But giving up less than a hit per inning, got a pretty decent walk rate for a relief pitcher at about 3.5 per 9 innings, not giving up a ton of home runs, which is obviously very impressive, especially for a guy whose home stadium is Coors Field. Again, that strikeout number is again, we talk about how the Rockies are not a huge strikeout team, and this is actually a pretty interesting microcosm to bring this up, because coming into this year, his strikeout rate per 9 innings was over 12, just over 10, and 10 in each of his last 3 seasons. And this year, it's under 7. So we're seeing a running theme here with this team. And again, I know he came over from Tampa, which is a team that is pretty well known for the way it develops its pitching, or at least teaches and coaches its pitching. But just another microcosm of something that I've banged on several times on this show. And something that caught my attention there as I was pulling everything together. But, just one of the main sort of stars, I would say, of the past several days in this a little bit better stretch than we've seen recently. Pardon. We had a couple of changes made roster-wise, and a couple of things happening on and off the field as well. We had Dakota Hudson come up. He was unclaimed on waivers after being DFA'd on Sunday, and he has been outrighted to AAA. So they're hoping that he's going to be able to sort of rebuild and kind of get his groove back a little bit, and perhaps come up again from Albuquerque and be a factor, hopefully again, in some W's later on in the season at some point. And just to refresh anybody who didn't hear about that one, he was DFA'd after Tanner Gordon was promoted back on Sunday. So, excuse me, that's how we got to this particular point. Looking again at some of the other games that we saw earlier this past week. Pardon me again. Again, but this is a team who is sitting 22 games back going into today. This is, again, a team that has, I mean, we there's no sort of surprise as to where we're at right now with regard to where they're at in the standings. And they are continuously being brought up and mentioned as perhaps one of the more interesting teams, along with Toronto, et cetera, as we lead up to the trade deadline. Obviously, if they're going to do anything, they're expected to be pretty significantly on the selling side. We've heard names like Elias Diaz, like Brendan Rodgers. And there's some increasing, I would say, I guess perhaps trend up in value for a couple of guys. It is, again, we talked about Elias Diaz. I talked about him as a fit potentially for the Red Sox. You see teams like the Padres potentially getting in on catching. I know the Yankees are potentially in on catching. And Brendan Rodgers, he missed a good chunk of last month due to hamstring issue, but he's somebody else who could be potentially available with the Amador, his recent knocking on the door, if you will. So I'll be curious to see how this. I don't think it'll impact it all that much, but I'll be curious to see if at all this sort of recent success by the team shifts, and the individual success that different players have had shifts in any particular way that these different players are valued both by the Rockies front office potentially and by the teams who will potentially be looking to acquire potentially some of these players. Mr. Burns says, watching from Cedar Hill, Texas, and then he follows it up with, whoops, I mean San Antonio, Texas. I'm on vacation. Hope you're having a great trip, Mr. Burns, and appreciate you coming on. And appreciate that even though you're on vacation, you were able to make a little bit of time to come on and have a good time with us tonight. So thank you very much. I'm glad to have you on again. It says, huge congratulations to the San Antonio Spurs for getting Chris Paul. That's something I'm curious to see if that has how much of a cultural effect that has. I'm not the biggest Chris Paul fan in the world, but I am curious from a leadership and veteran standpoint. Is he able to have some sort of a positive impact on guys like Wembanyama? Is he going to be potentially able to have more of a benefit on the floor and perhaps take this team up a little bit to a little bit higher heights than maybe people expect, kind of accelerate that rebuild a little bit, as we've seen some veterans do in the past in NBA and other leagues. So that'll be fun to watch over the coming year. And it's just somebody in Chris Paul who is one of the more respected veterans, and especially players at his position over the past several years. Mr. Burns also says, you will love it here in San Antonio. I've actually never been to Texas in my life that I can think of. If I go down to looking down at the Southeast, I've been to almost every state in the Southeast with the exception of that one. And Alabama, I think, is the only other one that I haven't been to after I go to Mississippi next week. Jody says, the Yankees in trouble yet? Jody, I've got plenty that I can say about the Yankees, but I'm not going to take too much time on this show to talk about that a little bit. But I will say in a word, yes. And, I'll be diving much more into that on Sundays. What's the Scoop? And I encourage you to come on there. I know you usually do. So I'll be talking a good amount more on there. I would hate to take up a chunk of a Rocky show venting about that. Mr. Wiltsey says, what do you think about the future Rockies teams with the current ownership? So, excuse me. I've historically not been a particularly fond of this ownership. I do think there are definitely worse regimes in baseball than this one. I think that they kind of have an odd situation where I think that in situations where you see like the Pittsburgh Pirates, which another team I could easily rant about right now, but I'm going to hold off on that for the moment, based on what happened today. If y'all didn't see the Paul Skenes, what would have been a no-hitter that ended up ending after 7 innings when they took him out after 99 pitches, even though he'd only allowed 1 walk and no hits to the Milwaukee Brewers through 7. So another thing you can hear about from me on Sunday, because I'm withholding that for now. But at any rate, so teams like the Pirates, teams like the Oakland Athletics, teams like the Cleveland Guardians, teams that historically, the Tampa Bay Rays, etc., teams that I have kind of been critical of their ownership at times for either being not willing to spend money or not willing to, or moving off of guys, when they're going to have to start being paid more, even if they were young and developed and very successful at the major league level in their early years. So, and I think almost what you have with Colorado is almost the antithesis of that, which is, this is a team that I think sometimes convinces itself that it's more competitive at the MLB level than it tends to be. I think we saw this at times past in situations where you had kind of moves like the Jose Reyes trade about a decade ago now, or you had guys moves like, I've talked about Ian Desmond. You had, or the decision to not trade Trevor Story when that happened. I know I've talked about that. Some of the moves that they made that year where they brought in guys like Holland and Wade Davis, and I think there was at least one other arm there. I know Tyler Chatwood was a relevant piece in that whole thing at some point. So I think they almost have the opposite issue where, and again, I will always admire and respect a team thinking that it's competitive and trying to go for it. But I also think there's manner in which you have to go about it. And I think that there's also there's got to be a method to the madness. And I think, Chris Bryant would have been another great example that one escaped me for a moment. But I think sometimes it's just a challenge where I do respect very much the fact that they have not really been willing to just kind of admit we're not a competitive team and try to at least appear competitive, or at least act in a manner that would be consistent with them being competitive. But I think sometimes it's at times as well, especially for a team that has been one of the least active teams on the international market, which is now more than ever where some of the great young talent is coming from, places like Cuba, places like Taiwan, places like the Dominican Republic, places like Japan. Obviously, Japan and Korea have always been up there. So I think that for a team that has historically sat out that market and really missed on a lot of opportunities because of that, I think the respect and the praise that I would heap on Montfort and company for those reasons would be, pardon me, is kind of the ceiling of that, and the respect that I'd have for that is somewhat hindered by the fact that the rest of their plan hasn't really been congruent with all of that. We've got a question here. Mr. Burns says, I'll go to Jody first. Jody says, Rockies need to fire Bud Black. I mean, I've historically, I've kind of said a few times, and this goes for any team, Colorado or any other team in any league. I tend to tend to have a hard time advocating for moving off of a specific coach or whatever the case may be until I know, okay, what's my alternative or who are guys I'm looking at. So if you have a couple of guys that you're thinking about in terms of, I would look at hiring him, or I would look at potentially him as a replacement, I'm curious to hear who you have in mind. I'm not necessarily saying that I disagree with you on changing managers, but I would like to know a couple of guys that you're thinking about. I know one guy who we talk about a few times, not just in the Rocky sense, but in general as a potential manager, is someone who Kenny Kirkpatrick really likes, is Mark DeRosa. I've been a big advocate for a guy like Raul Ibanez. He was the guy that I wanted in New York in 2017 when Girardi was let go. I am curious if at some point someone like Carlos Beltran resurfaces as somebody like that, because everybody else with regard to the Houston scandal in pretty significant manner, like AJ Hinch, Alex Cora, they all have since kind of being considered as paid their dues, and Carlos Beltran hasn't really had that sort of second chance, if you want to call it that, after being immediately let go by the Mets during that whole scandal before he managed even a game, the same way that other guys have. I'm not necessarily a huge fan of the idea of hiring Beltran, because I still have, I still look at him cross-eyed after that whole situation, especially with the reputation he had within the game for so long. But yeah, so those were a couple names that come to my mind, but I'm curious if you had anybody on your mind. Mr. Wiltsey says, I kind of wish Kroenke or Walton Group would show some interest. I don't know why. Maybe I'm reading too much into the Denver conversation, but I hear Denver, I hear sports business, I hear, getting more with the times, and, with regard to management and sports and one thing or another. I don't know why, but I've got this glaring just thought in my head of, what if Peyton Manning got involved in this? Because, I know he was somebody whose name came up not only with the Denver Broncos, but whose name came up with the Tennessee Titans at one point, and I think the Cleveland Browns, if I remember correctly, for a different position. And again, I know that that's football, but I am curious. I mean, if we're talking about Denver-related people from other sports, he is somebody who would come to mind for me potentially. But yeah, I definitely think that Kroenke or Walton would be a nice guy. Potential upgrade there. Mr. Burns says, question, is Charlie Blackmon still for the Rockies still out with a hamstring? Yeah, so even as recently as today, he's been out due to his right hamstring injury. There hasn't really been a significant, a lot of clarity in terms of when he'll be able to play again. For those who missed it, he tweaked his hamstring in making a pretty significant diving play, or at least an impressive diving play against the Reds on Monday during that shutout. And he did not play on Tuesday, which we were told was scheduled regardless. But it is pretty conspicuous. It's pretty conspicuous that today he is not in the lineup as well. Keith says, Manning with the Rockies, yes, please. Yeah, I would enjoy seeing that. Mr. Wilty says, Peyton and Health and co-owners. Throw in, put in De La Rosa, put in Jimenez, put in, the heck is his name? Why am I blanking on the other Rocky Hall of Famer recently? Larry Walker. Put all those guys, or Hall of Fame level player anyway. Just put all those, recent Denver sports stars, put them all in one group. I would love to see that as a general sports fan. That'd be a lot of fun. I typically think that the whole I see a lot of this on social media where either a coach will get hired or a GM will get hired or somebody in that sort of management business side of things or more business side of things will get a position and people will be like, oh, he never played the sport at a high level. Why do these positions keep going to people who, have never played MLB or never played NFL or whatever the case may be? I think that's a little oversold, but in this case with the Rockies, who have been kind of, can't get out of their own way for long enough. I mean, at this point, why not try it? At least try something different and something that's not completely entrenched in, the same mediocrity pipeline that they've been coming out of since the 07 NL title. Mr. Wilt, he says Peyton. Okay, I already read that. Mr. Wilty says, I lived in Denver for the Blake Street Bombers era. Yeah, that must have been a lot of fun. Excuse me. It's unfortunate, and it's just unfortunate. There were a few years ago, and it wasn't just 1 year; it was a couple of years where the Rockies looked like they might be turning things around. And I remember them winning. It was at least 90 games. I think it might have been more than 90 at one point. Just something that I was hoping would maintain longer than it ultimately did. But hopefully we're not too far off of the next opportunity to see them have that level of success. And hopefully it's a little more sustainable that time around. I will say, and this is something that I spoke with, I'll shout out my guy Trevor on this. I spoke with Trevor Salzman on in a recent episode and he pointed this out more than I did. So he gets the credit on this one. But just the fact that some of the drafting and some of the moves that they've made, at least in the last year or two, they appear to be a little bit more committed to this realm of things and to this current plan or process or whatever you want to call, whatever you want to say. I know that if there's any Philly basketball fans on here, I know if I say trust the process, they're going to have a little bit of a visceral reaction to that. But I do think that it's going to be. I'll be curious to see how that plays out because again, just the whole. And I don't want to beat the dead horse, but that whole minor league pipeline that I see, I am going to be watching to see if, whether it's a Dollander or whoever else it might be, if some of these guys if they're, really, hanging it out at the single A or high A or double A level, do they get aggressive with these guys and just jump them right to the majors as opposed to, really soaking them at double A, soaking them at triple A? Because I don't know what's going on down there. And you can go back to earlier episodes for what I've said about that. But I am curious if that becomes part of the new process, the new development system, or however you want to phrase it, if they kind of go that strategy a little bit more. Because for the guys that haven't spent a lot of time down there, that seems to be that they've had a little more success. And now they're finally seeing a couple of their guys start to get a little bit of footing, pitching wise at the major league level, it seems. That being said, have talked a little bit about what's going on this past week. And I mentioned that the draft is a couple days away. And I'm a huge, for those of y'all who have seen it on other shows, whether it's NFL particularly, but also NBA and definitely MLB as well. Big draft guy over here. I love following this stuff. Love looking at scouting reports. Love immersing myself in way more of this, player analysis than most people would ever have time on their hands or should have time on their hands for. But no, in all seriousness, I really enjoy this time of year. It's a lot of fun. And with that said, I looked at a couple of mock drafts. And again, I know that a lot of people write off mock drafts and just kind of say, oh, this is just, these are just people's opinions and, one thing or another. And to an extent, that's fairly accurate. But I think when you're picking third overall, especially in a situation where it's pretty increasingly believed that we know who those top 2 picks are likely to be. I think the Rockies, who have the 3rd pick, are in a very interesting situation with that. And they're in a position where the decision almost comes a little bit easier for them, because if they're between 3 or 4 players, obviously there's a decent chance that at least 1, if not 2 of those guys go before them to the Guardians and the Reds, who have the first 2 picks. But also, they're not super wedged in where you're picking 23, 24, and it's just like, well, don't get too in touch with somebody, because there's 23 teams ahead of us that could completely screw up our board. So and there's always those 1 or 2 teams that go off the board, not quite literally necessarily, but that really shake things up, especially in the MLB draft, because of the whole slot pool and every selection being, you're afforded a certain amount of money you can spend on that, and some teams like to go less than that maximum so they can go over later on, because that's allowed. If you go under slot at a higher pick, you can spend more money to bring in somebody who fell and get that value later on, which a lot of particularly smaller market teams, or allegedly smaller market teams — I don't think anybody's small market personally, but that's just me — a lot of those teams tend to have those types of tendencies. So excuse me. With that said, there's a couple of major mock drafts that have come out recently. One of them, we had from The Athletic. This is Keith Law. He's one of the higher, more popular, and one of the more typically well-respected sort of minor league baseball analysts, or mock draft analysts, however you want to phrase it. Number 3, he's got Wake Forest, who has been a very significant program recently. He's got Wake Forest pitcher Chase Burns going there. He also notes that guys like Yak Kalianone, who I mentioned last week, he's that 2-way player, even though there's skepticism as to whether that'll last well into his minor league and then ultimately major league career. But they are also in on Kalianone, and there's a decent chance that he does fall. I haven't heard him as a favorite at number 1 or number 2 to this point. The 2 guys that I have heard going there are Travis Bazana at Oregon State. He's a middle infielder going to number 1. And Charlie Condon, who's an outfielder going from Georgia at number 2 to Cincinnati. Those are the 2 that he's got in the top 2, and that's mostly what I have heard as well. But to get in a little bit to this guy, Chase Burns, just kind of give you guys a little bit of a sense of what you could be looking at with him. Looking at his different ratings, or kind of scouting breakdown, his biggest element of his pitching repertoire, his pitching arsenal, is definitely his slider. It's rated out at 70, which is very well above average. He's got a 4-pitch mix that includes a fastball, slider, curveball, and changeup. His command is not expected to be fantastic, but the belief is that at least his fastball and slider, and ideally his curveball as well, are going to be high enough and bring enough stuff where that command and that sort of average to below average command could potentially not be as detrimental. He sits with that fastball in the high 90s and can top out at just over 100 at about 101 miles per hour. He's one of the older players in this class. He's one of the guys who is already 21 years old, and there's only, according to what I've got here, there's only a handful of those, with the exception of Brock Moore, who's a whopping 24 years old. But yeah, Chase Burns is a guy that I definitely think they're keeping an eye on. He's considered to perhaps have the best breaking ball in this entire draft class, in one that is not perceived to have a ton of super high-end prospects, especially on the pitching side. So he's somebody that they're keeping an eye on from what Keith Law says, and just from what I've heard in general. I spoke about Kalianone last week to a decent extent. Looking more on the pitching side, on the position player side of things, which I'm a little more skeptical that they would go there. But if they do, there's a couple of guys who I could see being decent fits. Now, I don't know if whether Holt's going to fall. There's still some speculation that he could go in the top 2, but he's a middle infielder. If they go offense, he's potentially could be the number 1 prospect in this draft class. He doesn't do anything particularly excellently, but he also doesn't do anything particularly poorly. So he's kind of perhaps one of the, if you want to call it safer, I don't really love using that term when it comes to prospects, but he's perhaps one of the safer guys in this draft class. His scouting report, he talks about how he had a hamstring injury to start out this season, but he finishes through contact well. He's got a bit of a long swing, but he's got a compact build, and he's somebody who is, again, possibly a number one overall, even though in some other drafts he might go more in around the 4 or 5 range. He's got legitimate top potential here. Just going to clarify up on some comments. Hey, Scoop, I was never excited about the MLB draft because it would take 3, 4, 5 years before they make it. That's changed, but is it for the better? Excuse me. First of all, I definitely can understand and level with you on the fact that I had a hard time getting into it early on as well, for similar reasons. I mean, we look at NBA. I mean, I know guys can go to the G League, or guys can go, now go do international stuff, whatever. And we don't really see it as much with the NFL, and then NHL. I know that there's a little bit of a grace period. I don't know what you would really call it, development period, I guess, whether it's AHL or what have you, before you see guys jump on the NHL ice. I think that we're seeing a little bit less and less of that. I think guys are, I don't want to say they're being rushed, but I think guys are more experienced now. I think a lot of guys have taken a lot more at bats, have seen a lot more advanced, whether you're a hitter, you've seen a lot more advanced stuff off the mound, and vice versa. If you're on the mound, you've seen a lot more advanced teams in terms of hitters with regard to approach and strength and one thing or another. I think a lot of this is due to help with things like Driveline and StatCast and other places that are more into the sort of modern day StatCast. The StatCast, which really took hold around 2015. And then, whenever you want to call analytics, sort of really having taken on, whether that was the early 2000s with the Oakland A's, whether that goes, even though I know that there were people within the Yankees who were starting to work with similar material to what we've got going now, or at least sort of the ground level material that has become what we've got now, as far back as the 1980s. But that being said, I think that a lot of those things have tied into it as well. I do think that some of it's just an increasing lack, which that sounds a bizarre way to phrase it, but an increasing lack of patience, I think, on the part of some, I don't think the scouts necessarily, but I think the people who are using the scouts information, whether it's the GMs, the owners, and, and whatever the case may be. But we are seeing more and more, and it used to mainly be relievers, but I think that the guys who are doing that now, not just the relievers, but the guys who are doing that now, the Crochet types, the Paul Skeens types, even though he is definitely the exception to the rule from a lot of people's vantage points, including my own. I do think we'll increasingly see more and more of this. I don't necessarily think that that's a great thing. I think it's a case by case basis. I think it's hard to broad brush something like that. I do enjoy the fact, like, just as a fan, I do enjoy seeing guys have earlier debuts, and I do have a lot of respect. And years old are now out there doing, what they're doing on the MLB mounds or at the plate or in the field, whatever. But I do think that there's a bit of a balance there as well. And the main concern that I probably would say I have with it is the precedent that it could set, because you see somebody like a Paul Skeens get drafted and have the success he's having, ignoring the fact that he's a unicorn in several ways with regard to his game, his success, his mentality, his makeup, both physically and just between the ears, as they say. You've got somebody like that, and I worry that he's going to be a standard to which future number one picks or highly drafted pitchers or whatever the case, could be position players as well, will be measured. And I think that sometimes when you rush these guys too much, sometimes you can screw up their development too badly. And especially with teams, because again, the teams that are drafting, and this is particularly true in MLB, where you can't trade early draft picks, the teams that are drafting early are historically the teams that get it wrong, or at least that don't get it right all that often. So this is it's a lot of Kansas Cities, it's a lot of Colorado's, unfortunately, it's a lot of San Diego's, et cetera, et cetera. So I think when you have all of that type of balance, or not, well, balance is not the greatest word to use, but when I think you have that sort of overlap, I'll say, of sort of some level of desperation to get it right because of the fact that you've been picking highly so recently, and also this sort of overzealousness about that, but also the pressure that you're maybe putting more on yourself or perceive as being put on you because of the success some of these recent guys have had who have been drafted in that same level, or considered similarly and what have you. I think that those are major issues potentially, and it makes me remember go back to a couple years ago, and unfortunately I don't remember the specific names that were used at the time, but I was watching the draft and it was some middle round pick, and again I'm not going to pretend to remember specifics in all that great detail, but it was middle of the first round, and they were talking about how this guy's fastball reminds me a little bit of Pedro Martinez, or this guy's curveball reminds me a little bit of Clayton Kershaw. Like, these guys haven't pitched in minor league baseball, let alone major league baseball, and we're already putting, attaching part of their game to the name of one of the greatest to ever do it. And you know what that, especially with in certain fan bases where you've got guys, you've got teams like, the LA Dodgers, the Philadelphia Phillies, the New York Yankees, some of these fan bases, you're going to start saying, you're going to start hearing, oh, these guys are getting comped to, this guy or this guy. And, that's going to impact, I think, potentially how teams handle their development, unless they're really good at being insular from this and really focusing on the information at hand. If they're too distracted by some of this pomp and circumstance, I would really fear for some of these younger guys' development who go into these organizations that are not as consistently known for getting it right. So that would probably be my main concern, to kind of obviously put it in the long way. But that would be one of my major concerns there, is what this could mean for players going forward who teams are a little higher on their game than perhaps they should be, or they're appropriately high on these guys with their game, but it leads them to rush these guys and it stunts their development, or whatever the case may be, and screws up their careers, which I would obviously hate to see. Keith also says Brant of the Dallas Cowboys started using computers in 1962. That's the beginning of analytics and pro sports for me. Yeah, again, great example. It's, and I'm glad that you mentioned him. I think that, like you said, I think he's a great example. Obviously, I'm not a Dallas Cowboys fan, but I've got some people in their history that I really respect with regard to coaches and executives. I've mentioned Jimmy Johnson a lot as somebody who I'd put on my coaching Mount Rushmore. I was going to do that eventually, but there's my say that 3 times fast alert. You got to get one of those out per episode, apparently. But yeah, no, I think Brant's a fantastic example. I've been reading a book about the early Steinbrenner, early Cashman New York Yankees, and there was a lot of talk about how guys like Stick Michael was prominently mentioned, about guys who were using some of the ground level of this stuff back in the late 70s and the 80s, and heavily looking into it to not to solely use it, but to heavily use it to help influence positive decisions in building teams like the 90s dynasty. And again, the Cowboys obviously have had their success in the 70s and then the Jimmy Johnson era of the early 90s as well. So again, yeah, fantastic reference, I think. Going back to some of the other prospects, because I've mentioned a couple names. I mentioned last week my favorite prospect in this draft, which I know he kind of is a little bit of low-hanging fruit in terms of having him as a favorite. I'm talking about Urangelo Chinchi. Hope I pronounced that correctly, out of Mississippi State. Ironically, I'll be going to Mississippi in 6.5 days. But yeah, he's just somebody I'm really enjoying, because the sheer rarity of somebody who is a switch pitcher. I mean, it feels weird to say those words because of how rare it is to have that. And obviously there's a ton of risk with that, because it's twice the opportunity to get injured, twice the opportunity for mechanics or one thing or another. But man, is he going to be a fun story to watch. He's somebody who I hope falls to a little bit in the draft. but not somebody who I think is unfortunately going to make it down to Colorado's second pick. Although it would be a ton of fun to see if he'd be able to make that happen at Coors Field, and definitely would help sell some tickets down there. But he's if he does fall into the second round, I see no reason why Colorado shouldn't try and get him. But and then going back to some of the guys that Colorado, could also look at. I mentioned those. If we're looking at left-hander, definitely the left-hander pitcher who really sticks out is Arkansas's Hyden Smith. He's considered to have kind of middle of the road with regard to risk, but he really carved up the SEC, which is highly regarded in baseball, much as it is in football. He originally started with a 2-pitch mix, but he went and joined up joined it up with a changeup, which he's still working on the movement of, but he's got good command of. And there was a comp in this particular one from Fangraphs, and this scouting report from Fangraphs, that he could potentially be somebody who ends up as like a mid-rotation, perhaps a poor man's Madison Bumgarner. But and I think that's kind of more reasonable. I would like to see more comps like that of somebody who's been a good pitcher recently. But again, going back to the point I was making earlier, I really get frustrated seeing these guys because, again, different guys it gets in their heads in different ways. Some guys can really block it out and just say, I don't pay attention to it. But you start hearing certain players get this oh, he reminds me, his 5-tool game reminds me of Mickey Mantle, or his swing reminds me of Barry Bonds or one thing. And I'm just like, can these guys play 2 years in the minor leagues before we start putting the greatest players of all time in connection with them? Because I think that for some people who are more susceptible to it, not only could I think it could affect the players. Now, again, they know what they're signing up for, so I understand that counter argument as well. But also with regard to the fans, the expectations that ultimately, fans, we know how fanatics turn into with regard to, the passion and just, wanting their teams to always win, et cetera. And you're looking at that from that vantage point, and everybody's going to look like a bust when you start putting those type of labels or those type of expectations in fans' minds on certain players. Every player, with the exception of one every 10 years. Not every player is going to be Bryce Harper. Not every player is going to be pre-injury Steven Strasburg. Not every player is going to be, it's another example now, for at least for what we see for right now, Paul Skeens. Like, I talked a few months ago on, I think it was on What's the Scoop, actually, about sort of the declining what's been and I did not coin this term, so I don't want to. This is not something that I'm taking credit for in terms of the phrasing of it, but sort of that declining middle class in free agency in sports, where regards to everybody's either getting these minor league or league minimum or veteran minimum deals, or they're getting these $400 or $500 million contracts, becoming increasingly prevalent with regard to specifically. Guys like NFL quarterbacks and NBA, pretty much pick your position. It's pretty much ubiquitous in NBA. But with all of that, I think we're also kind of seeing it a little bit similarly with regard to how we evaluate prospects. People look at 50 value prospect. Now, just to kind of explain this a little bit, for those who don't follow scouting all that much, players in MLB and MLB prospects, both hitters and pitchers, are graded on a 20 to 80 scale. So 20 is the lowest of the low. 80 is like, you never see that as an overall. You see that as like a specific tool, maybe. Like, for those of y'all who know Billy Hamilton, his speed would probably be an 80. Ricky Henderson's speed would probably be considered about an 80. With regard to hit, Tony Gwynn Jr. Is probably somebody you would see up there. And you can go on and on. Aaron Judge's power would probably be an 80. So just to give some examples there, but future value on these guys, and that's kind of what you often see, is you often see two numbers, one for current value and one for future value. And the future value on a lot of these guys, and this is why I like places like Fangraphs, because in all respect to MLB Pipeline and what they do there, but I'm going to be critical of them here for right now, is just the fact that they put a lot of not tool, but overall, like 60, 65 grades on some guys, like, which means significantly like above average, which is like if not the absolute top tier of players, it's that sort of second top tier of players, that sort of 1B level of players. on these guys whose tools are mostly either average or slightly above average. And again, there's a lot of value in having those types of guys on your team, especially at positions like catcher, shortstop, center field, some second base. For average and slightly above average pitchers, there's a good market, and there's a lot of need and a lot of demand for those types of players in the major leagues. Not every team is, as much as they want to, not every team is going to have 26, Otanis or, pre getting beaten up Mike Trouts or guys like that. But I see these numbers just thrown around like Jolly Ranchers. And I think it kind of dilutes in the minds of fans who really rely heavily on these analyses and on these scouting reports to formulate their opinions of guys who are either in their systems or are going to be in their systems or whatever. And I think that they're a little bit too, or they're not as judicious as I think they should be at times with that. That's one reason why I like FanGraphs is it's a lot more picky and choosy with who it assigns these higher numbers to. I'll just as an example right now, I'll look at the list of guys available in the draft. They project about 5 of these players to be to achieve league average status, which I think is about fair. And of course, there's always the chance that 1 or 2 of these guys can explode beyond that, and who's to say? That's something we can't project. But I like the fact that they're more tempered with that, and other organizations. I know Pitcher List is good with that. I know there's another one that I'm blanking on right now, but I'll try and get the name of it that I really like. But that's one thing that I try and be wary of when I'm looking at scouting reports from these different secondary sources. And again, these guys there are some really great insiders and some really great baseball people who write some of these up. But I just think sometimes it can be a little bit overzealous. And I do notice that this ties in a lot with market sometimes. I think that some players on teams like the Mets or the Yankees and other organizations, I think tend to sometimes get, because of the hype that comes with them, I think that pulls up their expectation as a little bit more than it ought to be from where those, I think, numbers would more accurately be. That long spiel having been sort of concluded there. I'm for Colorado. Just to kind of throw a couple more names at you guys as people I've heard. Excuse me. Again, those top 2 guys, one of them could definitely fall in terms of the Travis Bazzana or the Charlie Condon. Both of whom are infielders, so either one of those falling to them at 3 wouldn't surprise me at all. But that's generally the top 5 you're looking at is Weatherholt, second base, Bazzana, second base, Condon, third base, or the pitchers Smith and Burns. And again, Burns out of Wake Forest, which has a very good program, especially for pitching recently. Burns again is the one who I have heard the name the most, I would say. Pardon. Now, looking a little bit ahead now, because we've got obviously only a few games coming up before the All-Star break, but I do think it's going to be an interesting few games. It's a road series coming up against the New York Mets starting tomorrow. And the Mets, for those of y'all who haven't followed them, the Mets were a team that started out in the absolute doldrums this year. They were a team that people were looking at as potential shoo-ins to sell. They were a team that was being considered, one of the worst in baseball. They were a team that just people were looking at and being like, oh, here we go again, same old Mets, in terms of having had much higher expectations than they ultimately looked to achieve. As of right now, the Mets are right in the thick of things in the National League wild card, sitting 2 games over 500, entering today, projected to win about 83 or 84 games. And about a coin flip to make the playoffs. They're at about, according to this simulation, they're at about 45% chance to make the playoffs. So this is a real team. This is a formidable team that they're going to be going up against. This is a team that's coming in on a hot streak recently. Again, they started out terribly. So for them to be 2 over 500 right now, once Edwin Diaz came off of that suspension, which was very controversial among most people for that the whole sticky stuff scandal. But I'm looking forward to watching what they're able to accomplish in that series. The Mets don't have the same elite level of pitching that they once did with guys like DeGrom and Scherzer, etc. But they are a team that consistently is able to they still have guys like pardon me, sorry. They still have guys like Lindor there and Nimmo, both of whom were heavily looked at as being considered snubs for the All-Star game next week when the initial finalizations came out on the rosters and they were not involved. They also have had some really solid offensive production from guys like Mark Vientos, who's been up for about half the season. Francisco Alvarez is another one. And then on the pitching side of things, pardon me, they've got some relievers who have done decently better, even in the absence of guys like Diaz and Diaz has actually struggled a decent amount a few weeks ago, at least on a temporary basis. But these are pitchers that do not allow a lot of home runs. These are hitters that hit a decent amount of home runs. You got double-digit home runs from both the guys I mentioned, as both the guys I mentioned, as well as JD Martinez. So they're a team that's going to potentially give Colorado a run for their money in that they don't play into Colorado's strengths and they have the ability to exploit some of Colorado's what have historically been weaknesses. So I'll be keeping an eye on those elements. I said similarly regarding their situation against Milwaukee a couple of weeks ago, but the situations are very similar. These are teams that I think have very similar constructions, especially in even going right down to the fact that they lost a couple of their better players, especially on the pitching side. And even regardless, they have some of the players at least have ended up having more success than they had prior. So we've got a couple comments coming in. So I'm just going to say, okay, Kenny jumps in and says, says, what's up, Scoops? Busy night at work. So one question for me tonight. First off, just want to say, appreciate you coming in. And I hope that everything's going well at work. And thank you for tuning in. Are you a fan of every team having a representative? Yes, Ryan McMahon is deserving, but if he wasn't, would you want a Rockies player, or do you want to see the best of the best? Thanks, Scoops. I'm so glad you asked this question. I was hoping somebody would. Every team having a representative rule is garbaggio, in my opinion. It is terrible. I don't think it's representative of the best of baseball, and I think that it really mars what the All-Star game is supposed to be and really dilutes or at least murkies what the All-Star game is supposed to be. Because how many times have we listened to people as they're, these BBWAA and these veteran committee as they're evaluating guys for the Hall of Fame, which you can argue over who should be voting for that or not. But just as in examples like that, how many times have we said, well, he was an All-Star 6 times, he was an All-Star 12 times, he was an All-Star 3 times. But how many people are actually voting on who the best guys are? I mean, a few years ago, we saw the Atlanta Braves dominate one year when their fans went on a voting spree. We had, I think it was the Milwaukee Brewers or the Cleveland Indians, or I don't remember who it was. It was some random Central team one year. It really has just become, especially with the fan voting, it really has just become a contest of, popularity. In fact, there was a year or two ago, there was a year or two ago where someone, I think, got like second or third highest votes among everybody and had like league average numbers. So, and I think just tying this in as well, the biggest issue for me, I think with the representation is that if you're putting in a player from every team, if you're guaranteeing a player from every team, now again, there's not necessarily a number cutoff, specifically a hard cutoff of you have to have this many position players, this many pitchers, and that's it, whatever the case may be. It tends to be somewhat discretionary. That being said, the manager has to have at least a soft cap, if not a hard cap, in his mind of I'm having this many starters, this many relievers, this many whatever. So that means if you have to guarantee, like let's say he's got the first 25 guys that he thinks or that have been put in, and then the rest has to be decided by this coaching and all of that. So let's say he's got those first 25 guys. That means that, and he knows, well, I still haven't represented these 4 teams because these 4 teams are absolute trash. That means that he has to pick at least one guy from each of these 4 trash teams, and that means that very respected, very successful, and very well-performing players who have been highly voted for in many cases are not getting spots. because they have to capitulate to these teams that are on pace to lose 110 games, that are on pace to bring to mind the 1962 New York Mets. If you want it to be the all-star game, and you want to utilize things like all-star appearances for things like home run voting. I mean, a few years ago, they did away with that whole winner of the all-star game gets home field advantage for the World Series. So it appears that they are kind of doubling down more on the entertainment and fan vote value of it, as opposed to how much it actually means for how well players have performed or how successful players are, which is fine. But then call it something other than the all-star game. Whether somebody's an all-star or whether somebody is, has a designation or plays in that game or gets voted as that to me should be about their production, their numbers, their contributions to their team on the field. To me, it shouldn't be about, this guy played for the Mets, so he got, 300,000 votes. I'm just making up numbers here. So he got 300,000 votes, even though he wasn't as good as this team that played for the Anaheim Angels, who got 160,000 votes. It's maddening to me I'll channel Kurt Valenti here. It's garbage. Yeah, Kurt, hope you're doing well, buddy. Hope you're feeling better. That was for you. But yeah, it really ticks me off. Not a fan of it. And to me, it dilutes what the All-Star game should be. And again, if they want to double down on this, then fine. But you got to call it something else then, because it is not the All-Star game at that point. Whew. Thank you for those who are still here and listening on that. Stanley, I am not going to pronounce that last name because this is a family show. Mets will sweep Rockies. Crazier things have happened. That's all I'll say. I'm not really in a great position where I would be comfortable really predicting an outcome in that series, because the Rockies have really surprised me at times recently. But the Mets and the Rockies are both perhaps the most known for disappointing that anybody else could be. Keith says, Kim Kardashian is a star, not an all-star, LOL. I don't even know how to respond to that. Kenny says, give me North America versus the world in the All-Star game. That's the best. Yes. Thank you, Kenny. This is exactly, I would love to see this in all four sports. I'd love to see this in MLB. I'd love to see this in NFL, NBA, NHL. I really appreciate that. And new matchups all around. I think that'd be great for the game. I think it'd be great for the fans. And I think the players would like that as well. That being the last question, the last comment rather, I don't want to miss this opportunity as the show has gone a lot faster than I anticipated, but I don't want to miss this opportunity to tell y'all a little bit about our sponsor, Morgan Trinkets. With over 33 years of experience, they are your headquarters for Southwest Pottery and Jewelry, as well as estate gold at wholesale prices. Starting in 1990, once a nationwide company, they now do shows exclusively in northern Colorado and southern Wyoming. All their gold is real gold, 10, 14, or 18 karat gold. All their silver is sterling silver. How do you find Morgan Trinkets? On Facebook by searching Morgan Trinkets today. If you catch Morgan Trinkets at one of their shows, they take all major credit cards, and on Facebook, they take PayPal. All orders over $50 are shipped for free. Check out Morgan Trinkets. That's Morgan Trinkets on Facebook today. And of course, I want to shout out Ms. Pearl Heater, who is an incredible supporter and avid viewer of all of our shows on this network as well. And really appreciate all that she's done, and excited to have the opportunity to talk about them a little bit. That being said, we are ticking up a little bit, just close to the buzzer. So just want to take a second to just mention this because, excuse me. So guys, I just want to let y'all know going into next week, next Thursday, next Thursday, the 18th, not going to be a 9 p.m. Settle the Scores Eastern Time show that day. I'll be sending out information regarding the specifics with that and how that gets reconfigured, but not going to be on next week. I'll be taking my first trip to my soon-to-be new home in Mississippi. Will not be able to at that specific time be on air. So just keep an eye out for that. But just wanted to let y'all know in advance, and I apologize, but looking forward to being on with you guys again soon. And of course, as I always say, looking forward to on Sunday having a bunch of you. I know a bunch of y'all are always very active with me on my Sunday nights, and I appreciate that. And look forward to seeing y'all on Sunday night for What's This episode. 9 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Mountain. And thanks again for your amazing engagement and a lot of fun comments and a lot of fun questions tonight. I'm still perplexed by that Kim Kardashian one. But for now, I'm going to say have a nice evening, and I will see you again soon, not next Thursday night, but soon for another opportunity to settle the scores with our Colorado Rockies. Good night, y'all.